So I've been using the Fujifilm X-T4 for a year, 2 months, and a few weeks, something like that. I put it through its paces. I've done a lot of video projects with this, and I have a lot to say about it. What is going on, guys? Eric White in the building, and welcome to the Fujifilm X-T4 review. Now, before we even get started with this video, I had this video recorded probably around like 2 weeks ago. I did all the B-roll for it, and then two really big things happened that kind of changed my opinion about it, and it made the video I made kind of not irrelevant, but I have a very different perspective on the whole system and the camera as a whole. And I decided to go ahead and redo this video, and I kind of want to go over a lot more things that I didn't talk about in that video as well. So let's go ahead and start doing that. The first thing that you're going to notice about the Fujifilm X-T4 that definitely sets it apart from all the other cameras that are even coming out to this day is definitely the build quality and how the camera looks overall. It's a very hipster retro looking camera. You have the dials up top that you can manually control the ISO and the exposure compensation, which is very unique, and a lot of cameras don't even do that, and I actually appreciate it. Sadly, I really didn't use them that much because I mainly just go ahead and change the settings inside the camera. So I have all the settings up top locked, which is actually a really nice feature. You can lock all the settings on the individual button dials up top, which is really nice. Now, once you go to the left side of the camera, you're going to be greeted with a few different ports. At the top, you're going to have a mic jack if you want to plug in an external mic. Now, the one annoying thing about this build, especially with the mic jack being in the place that it is that it's going to block the flip out screen, and it does it way more often than not. What you're going to have to do if you want to get around this is you're going to have to flip out the screen just slightly, tilt it in such a way that you can bring it all the way to flip it out to see yourself, and then go ahead and tilt it all the way back. It's a weird maneuver that you have to do, but you know, I don't know how they didn't think about this when they were designing the camera. But right under the mic jack, you have the remote in case you want to plug this into an external shutter release, or you want to hook this up to a slider, which I recently have, and do some kind of hyperlapse, which is actually a really useful feature. Below that, you have a a micro HDMI, which is, I understand why people do not like micro HDMIs. I have probably went through 2 or 3 cables already in the past few months that I've gotten my Atomos Ninja 5, and that is the most annoying thing ever. You can literally not be doing anything, and somehow, some way it gets bent, or the cable stops working, or it gives you some weird error message. It is very finicky, and I really understand why people always hated on these ports. I didn't understand it at first, but now, having to use it pretty much every shoot that I go on, you can go through cables so fast and so quickly, it's actually ridiculous. Now, under that port, you have a USB Type-C in case you want to transfer any files through your computer, which I actually haven't done, or you just want to go ahead and charge the camera. It's not going to be as fast as actually charging the battery, but it is something that you can do. There were a few times where I tried to charge the battery through the USB Type-C while I was shooting, and because the voltage is so low, it didn't really charge it as fast. It prolonged the battery just a little bit, but it didn't necessarily do too much at the end of the day, and it is prone to overheating, which we'll talk about at the end of this video. And on the right side of the camera, you are greeted with 2 SD card slots that support UHS 2, which is very useful, and one of the reasons why I decided to pick this camera up. It actually came in handy recently when I was on a shoot. For some weird reason, for the first time in my entire lifetime of owning this camera, one of the SD cards failed for some reason. Luckily, I had another one, and I just swapped to that one, and there wasn't really a problem. So if you are a person who doesn't want to have that fail on you, or you really want to have that fail safe, having 2 SD cards is definitely a feature that should be in every camera, and it was really nice to see on this one as well. Now, right under the SD card, you're going to find the battery slot. The battery life on this is actually pretty good. There was a video shoot that I did probably a few weeks ago where I was doing a wedding, and I was at the client's house from around 10 o'clock and all the way up until 3 o'clock. I went through both the batteries that I have, which is probably around like 5-ish hours. So I was turning it off and on. I was getting shots here and there. Towards the latter half, when I was just completely had the camera on and was shooting all day, I was probably getting around 2 hours, a solid 2 hours, 2.5 hours of solid shooting, keeping the camera on, recording, not turning it off at all, just with a single battery fully charged. So depending on your usage, you can probably extend that to maybe 3 or 4 hours if you're shooting on and off. But for the most part, the battery life is decent, and I can pretty much get through every shoot that I have with just those 2 batteries. So that's really nice to see. Now, another great thing about this camera system as a whole and the Fujifilm system is the camera menus are very, very straightforward and easy to understand. Literally the first time I got this all the way back in last year, it took me, I don't even know how long, probably a few minutes to figure out all the settings that I wanted to shoot. Everything is really easily laid out. They don't try to confuse you with weird words, and they don't have all these weird options like you can see on Sony cameras. And I know that because recently the B-roll that I shot for this video was actually shot with my friend's Sony camera. I couldn't even figure out how to get that thing into S-Log, which is more of a fault of mine, but it was so hard trying to figure out how to work that. There's like 14 different pages for one page, and everything is worded so weirdly and it's confusing. It's really nice to know that, especially since I didn't come from another camera system. I went straight from shooting cameras on my phone to this system. It's really, really nice to see something really easy and straightforward. If you want to shoot in 4K, movie options, if you want to shoot in long op or all intra, you have all these different things. It's really, really easy and straightforward if you want to pick this up and start shooting. Or if someone who doesn't really know how to work cameras, you can pretty much tell them, hey, just go to this setting and do this, and they should pretty much be able to know what that means, where it is in the system, and what they're doing, because it's just that easy to understand. Now, one of the best things about shooting with this camera is by far the image quality. If you've seen any videos or reviews besides this one, you know that the image quality coming out of this camera is so good. Especially with a lot of other cameras like the Sony a7 III and some Canon cameras, you were kind of stuck at 8-bit, but with this camera, you're getting a 26.2 10-bit 420 at 4K 60, and the image quality is so good. F-Log grades super easily, and for someone who hasn't really worked with F-Log in the past or any log footage, it was really easy to get accustomed to and figure out how it works. It's really easy to expose for. There's not some trick that you have to do so that you don't clip anything or that nothing is underexposed. It's really straightforward and easy to use. It grades so nicely, and by far the image quality is one of the best things about this camera. Now, the autofocus in this camera is probably one of the biggest controversies that I've noticed or that I've seen in the community of people who actually use this camera. The autofocus is not great. It's definitely decent, but it's not great. Like, for instance, right now I have the flip out screen. I can see that there's a box around my eye, and I have it on auto eye detection, so it switches between the left and right. The camera knows in simple environments like this where my face is, and it doesn't have a hard time, differentiating that. But in complicated backgrounds, and I've seen this plenty of times, it for some reason has a hard time figuring out what is a face and what isn't. There's a lot of times where I'd be out in the field shooting videos or even taking pictures, and the focus will be on the person's face and then all of a sudden shift to a tree or shift to a car and completely throw off the focus and shift focus and make the whole shot basically not usable. And it's really hard to tell the Fuji system do not do that, because you can't tell the Fuji system what is a face and what isn't. So a lot of times I'd be having a great video, I'd be moving the camera, or I'd be getting a shot, and the focus would shift to a fence or a car, and it basically ruins the shot. But for the most part, a lot of times, if it was up to me, if I had to choose between using autofocus for an interview or just using manual focus, 9 times out of 10, I'm just going to use manual focus, because I figured it's a little bit more reliable and I don't have to guess and figure out if it's going to shift focus or not, because I'm setting the focus myself. Now, the great thing about this system is that there are a few ways that you can adjust it. You can adjust the speed and a few other things, a few other parameters, but at the end of the day, the autofocus, especially the face and eye detection, is not the greatest. I think with the software update, it can easily be fixed, but for the most part, it has sometimes a hard time determining what is a face and what it isn't, and sometimes that can actually end up ruining your shots. Now, the other biggest thing about this camera, that's probably the biggest controversy, and not even in this camera, but just in other cameras in general that have IBIS, is how good or bad IBIS is. Now, before I even get to this, I have to let you guys know what IBIS is and what IBIS isn't. IBIS is not going to fix bad or shaky footage. And what I mean by that is, If you are out in the field and you're trying to get a shot and you're not trying to stabilize yourself in some way and make sure that you're walking on your tippy toes, that you're trying to lock yourself and have a point of contact so the image isn't going all over the place, IBIS isn't going to fix that. Now, it can assist you in those moments when you're trying to get a stable shot and you're doing all those things. But if you're just walking around and having your camera and waving it around any kind of way, it's not going to make the footage look good. That's not what it's supposed to be. It's supposed to assist you in getting better footage and stabilizing the footage. It's not supposed to be the only way the footage is stabilized if you don't know what you're doing. Now, with that said, there were times when I would try to do that, but it just was very jerky and aggressive. There are some times where I would be out in the field trying to get a shot and I would be moving or panning the camera around, and the IBIS would understand that a little bit too late or understand it too aggressively and jerk to fix it, to smooth it out. And it oftentimes looks really weird, and you can't fix it in stabilization and warp stabilizer and the regular stabilization in DaVinci Resolve. It's kind of just something that you have to live with, and it's really, really frustrating because it never does it smoothly. It's always really jerky and aggressive. Now, there are some shots obviously where it helps and it's nice and smooth, but probably 6 to 7 times out of 10, it's really jerky and stiff and aggressive, and it can kind of ruin some shots if you don't know how to react to it or how to make sure that you're doing it smoothly so that it doesn't kick in so aggressively. Now, luckily, I've had the camera for a year and some change, which means I've had a bunch of time to shoot a bunch of pictures, and I can definitely say the photos coming out of this thing are amazing. The raw files, if you're shooting uncompressed, can be huge, some even being like above 50 megabytes. So if you shoot in compressed raw, it's not really going to change too much. All it really is going to do is save you money and storage, because they literally cut the size in half and it's only around like 25 to 30 megabytes per photo. So with those compressed raw photos, you are still getting amazing quality. The colors are really easy to grade, to throw your LUTs on there, to manipulate the highlights. The highlight recovery is actually very well. There's a few times where I overexposed some images and all I had to do was bring the highlight slider down slightly and I get those back. And overall, I've shot some really great images on this, and probably some images that I'm gonna end up getting framed and hung up in my room or my house somewhere, just because at 26.2 megapixels, they're gonna be nice and sharp, and they're really gonna look nice once they're actually blown up and not super blurry. The autofocus works great during these modes when you're shooting photos and everything like that. But overall, the images coming out of this are amazing. If you're someone who's a hybrid shooter who also likes to do photos every now and then, you're definitely gonna get your money's worth out of this camera. Now, a few of the things that I didn't necessarily like about this camera, one being the auto white balance. This is something that you shouldn't necessarily depend on, but it is something that I noticed once or twice when I was out shooting in different scenarios. If you have somewhere where there's mixed lighting potentially, or you have somewhere where, you know, things can be kind of challenging, it has a hard time figuring out which white balance to go to. And there's a couple times when the subject would lean in or the subject would do something on camera and you could see it get warmer and cooler and sort of pulse back and forth. Now, luckily, this can easily be fixed. I mapped the arrow up button on this to be an auto white balance lock, so I really don't run into that issue as much. I sort of just leave it on auto white balance, and right before I shoot, I just lock the balance so that it's not shifting during that, but it is something to be aware of. Now, the second thing that I don't like, and I mentioned this earlier, is the ports on this camera. Like I said, I've gone through around 2 or 3 of these micro HDMI ports because they just break so easily. I understand why people hate this port so much. You will go through these things so fast because they're so flimsy and easy to break. And the port that goes into the Fujifilm itself can easily get bent if you slightly angle it wrong or anything. So you really have to be careful with that. Now, the other thing that actually came up more recently, and the reason why I decided to do this whole video over again, is 2 big reasons: overheating and the SD card slots. Now, last week when I was trying to shoot this exact video, actually, I ran into a write error or something along those lines to where it wouldn't record anything on any of the SD cards that I had. I switched the slots, I tried a different SD card and a different SD card, and I really wish I would have recorded it, and because it doesn't happen anymore and I haven't had the problem occur anymore. But it was a really weird problem and I wasn't sure exactly what it was. And it was before I updated the system. After updating the system, it was still giving me those write errors, and I'm really not sure why to this day. And that scares me, 1, because I don't know why it was happening, and 2, because I don't want to be out in the field where I don't have my IBIS 105 and run into those right errors and I'm stuck and I don't have anything to shoot with. That could literally lose me a client and a gig and a bunch of other bad things. So I'm really not sure what that was, but it is a big deal to keep in mind. Make sure that you go on Fujifilm's website or go to some type of forum where they let you know exactly what SD cards work with it, because I didn't do that, and that was the first time I ran into that problem after a year of having the camera. Now, the other thing that you have to keep in mind about this camera is the 4K 60, and this is the other really big thing that happened last week when I was shooting with this camera that kind of changed my opinion a little bit. When I was shooting 4K 60 for a long period of time, I realized that it started to overheat relatively quickly. I was shooting a volleyball game and I was in the gym and it was a little bit warmer in there. I'd probably say around like almost like 76, 78 degrees ish in there. And after about 30 to 40 minutes of having the camera on, not shooting, but just having the camera on, it started to give me the overheat warning like, hey, it's getting hot. You might want to turn it off soon. And there's nothing I can do about it. Now, in the new Sonys, you can adjust, you know, the temperature sensitivity to high and everything like that. You can't do that in the Fuji. All you can do is turn it off and wait. So there were a lot of times, probably 2 or 3 times when I was shooting the volleyball game where I'd have to turn the camera off, let it cool down, turn it back on, only to get around like maybe 15, 20 more minutes, turn the camera off. And what that did was it made me miss a lot of good shots that could have been in the video that I was making for them. The other thing that you have to keep in mind is there is a slight crop in the 4K 60 mode. I want to say it's around 1.18 or 1.2, but it is a pretty noticeable crop. And if you're trying to go between 4K 24 and 4K 60, you want to keep that in mind. Another thing is if you are going to be shooting in the H.265 where there's 10-bit 420, it is going to be very taxing on your computer. Now, for instance, I have the Founders Edition 2070 Super, the RTX cards, and I also have a 3700X for my CPU, and this thing easily brings the editing system to its knees. And a lot of times I have to slow down, give it a break, or in DaVinci Resolve, generate optimized media, because there's a lot of times where it just chugs and chugs and it's really, really slow to edit with. So you want to keep that in mind. So at the end of the day, where does that leave us with the Fujifilm X-T4? For me, I'm probably not going to keep it for too much longer. I'm probably planning on upgrading in the next few months or so once I actually get the money for it, which I was planning on doing earlier, but I've already put so many gigs and miles onto this thing that I just decided to keep it for a little bit longer. But at the end of the day, I think that for $1,800 or $1,700 more recently, you are getting a really great camera. 10-bit 420, 4K 60, dual SD card slots that support UHS 2. You get a flip out screen, you get decent battery life, great image quality. There are very, very few systems and cameras that come close to giving you what this camera gives you for such a cheap price. Now, yes, you can go with the R6, but that body alone is $2,500. The FX3, the A7S III are upwards of $3,500. The Sony A6400, although a great camera, does slack on a lot of features and it only has 8-bit. There's just a lot of things that this camera gives you that a lot of other cameras are not going to give you unless you pay a little bit more for that. At the end of the day, this is probably a camera that I can recommend to anyone who's like me, who kind of does video work, maybe a little bit of photo work, and even people who do a lot of photo work. It has all the features, eye tracking. I think this supports up to almost 30 frames a second in electronic shutter. So it is definitely not lacking on the photo side at all. I just don't take too many photos with it. But like I said, at the end of the day, I think this is a great camera for a lot of people. And even in 2021, where we have FX3s and A7 IVs and all these other cameras coming out, it still stacks up relatively well to those and even beats some of them in some categories. So thank you guys for watching the video. Hopefully you guys enjoyed it. If you guys are new, click that sub button, join Innovation Nation. If you guys like the video, click that like button, turn it blue. And just like always, I see you guys in the next one.